according to Greenwich Mean Time, it's 12 noon, and I've always wondered why we couldn't have Greenwich Nice Time, but we'll go with whatever they offer us. Live from the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads University, on the traditional lands of the Kosamson and Lekwungen families, on the south shore of Vancouver Island, on the western edge of Turtle Island. Welcome to our quarterly seminar series, Communication Matters. I'm your moderator, Geo Takach. I'm a faculty member in the School of Communication and Culture, joining an all-star cast of panelists and hosts who bid you Adeleye, Nin Hao, Assalamu alaikum, Shikamu, Shalom, Namaste, and so much more. Or in my ancestral lingo, Servustok Neepsheg Tarshoshag, which translated extremely loosely means howdy folks. For the next hour, we will explore the topic of intercultural communication in turbulent times. We begin by acknowledging that Royal Roads University is located on the traditional lands of the Kosamson and Lekwungen families, and we invite you to reflect on whose traditional lands you are joining us from. And if you're not sure of that yet, we invite you right after this webinar to go find out and then reflect on what those lands mean to you. So let's take a couple of moments to do that. Okay, two technical tidbits before we go. Turning off your video, if you notice a bandwidth problem, turning off your video will certainly help with that. If it starts to lag, otherwise you will need to move closer to your Wi-Fi gateway or heaven help you attach an old school internet cable and go that route. There's a chat box for you to post questions in the question and answer session that will follow the panel discussion. Please hold your questions until we ask for them at that point. There's a message capability there, but please note that the default setting is to everyone. You have a choice in the bottom left corner of the chat box to frame who you're sending the message to. You can also send private messages by activating the list and scrolling down to the identified attendees and selecting the one you want. For example, our gracious hosts. Speaking of our gracious hosts, on the theory and on the folklore that it takes a village to raise a webinar, I would like to introduce our fabulous hosting team. Jackie Lee is our eminent program assistant from our BA in Professional Communication program, or BAPC, for the syllabically thrifty crowd. Give us a wave, Jackie.
Buddy.
Thank you. Louise Baxfield, BAPC Program Coordinator, is in the house. Hi, Louise. Allana McConachy, Education Advisor and in-house Webinar Oracle, is also gracing us with her attendance today. Further shout out to Russ Cheney, our indispensable wingman from AV Services. He's recording this webinar for later viewing, if not the rumored resurgence of the lucrative VHS cassette market. I just read about that on social media this morning. All right, let's now move on to our topic. Recent years have seen the rise of movements like Indigenous rights and Black Lives Matter to acknowledge and address long-standing institutionally entrenched racial injustices in Canada and beyond. In this special edition of our speaker series, 3 expert panelists are gathered to share their thoughts on how principles of intercultural communication can help us navigate and negotiate the many challenges of depolarizing the sometimes heated dialogue that can arise around issues of race, on the way to furthering the important work of resisting and rectifying racial and other injustices. So let's meet our headliners on our distinguished panel in alphabetical order, at least as far as the English language argues. Olaolu Adeleye, is a highly valued associate faculty member of the School of Communication and Culture. Olaolu, thank you. He brings a passion for human and children's rights and intercultural communication to this session, informed by his studies in international development and his experiences, considerable, with global organizations. He's worked with government, non-government, and multilateral organizations, including the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Canada's permanent mission to the Organization of American States in Washington, DC, Right to Play's Canadian National Office in Toronto, the UN International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, headquartered in Geneva, and UNICEF in Lima. He holds a Master of Science in Poverty Reduction, Policy and Practice from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, and a BA in International Development from Dalhousie University. Our next panelist, Wayne Clark. Wayne is originally from Churchill, Manitoba. He is an enrolled Inuk beneficiary of the Nunavut Land Claim Agreement, Whale Cove. He worked in various program management roles, focusing on Indigenous health, research, communication, and culture. His expertise is in community engagement, Indigenous research methodologies, and program evaluation. He was an inaugural board member of the Manitoba Inuit Association, where he formalized a partnership with Ongomiswin Research and established a protocol for Inuit research engagement. He holds a doctorate in education, and distance education, as a matter of fact, from Athabasca University, a Master of Arts in Professional Communication from Royal Roads, where he continues to be regarded with respect and fondness, and a Bachelor of Business Administration from the University of Winnipeg. He also has a certificate in cultural competence and cultural safety from the Canadian Healthcare Association, and certificates from UBC in project management, in business system analysis, and also in internet marketing. Juana Du. Hello, Juana. Juana is my colleague, associate professor and head of the MA in Intercultural and International Communication program in the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads. She draws on her wealth of personal experience from working in Beijing, Hong Kong, Germany, the US, and Canada to frame how she studies culture, communication, and organizations. Her research interests include improving intercultural communication in a globalized world, cross-cultural adaptation of international students, and too much more to list here. She has taught graduate and undergraduate courses in intercultural communication, interpersonal communication across cultures, organizational communication, and too much more to list here. She has been an OrgCom research consultant for multinational organizations. Her PhD is in intercultural and organizational communication from Hong Kong Baptist University. She has an MA in intercultural communication and a BA in Chinese language and literature, both from Peking University. So that is our panel. Let us turn, shall we, to our topic. How can the theory and practice of intercultural communication help us to address the challenges of communicating in these turbulent times? The panel discussion will be presented as, you guessed it, a panel discussion in which we have a number of questions that the panel has considered, and we are just going to have an unrehearsed discussion of these questions. So panel, over to you on the first question. What does intercultural communication mean to each of you?
So, I'll start first. It's Wayne here. I see intercultural communication as a bridge that promotes dialogue or expression of needs and perspectives and nuance in a manner that is translatable and meaningful. One of the earlier forms of intercultural communication was the lingua franca language that was used for communication between people who do not share a common language, as a means to communicate, particularly in areas of business or government. And of course, today with media and technology, globalization, social movements, and so on, there's more emphasis on the need for intercultural communication, not only in business, but in areas where social barriers can cause harms to groups who are disadvantaged because of race or ethnicity, geography, sex, gender, and the like. There's been, a tremendous amount of emphasis placed on some of these issues, and I see intercultural communication as a means to support dialogue and processes that will help create change.
Wow, thanks very much for starting us off, Wayne.
I'll speak now, and I'll build on what Wayne has said. I mean, really, when we talk about intercultural communication, we're talking about multiple imperatives of why we actually even discuss it in the first place. So we spoke about the economic imperative. We have the demographic imperative, given that we live in Canada, which is so diverse and has an act, a multiculturalism act, which in theory celebrates the different cultures which we have in our country. Then we have our self-awareness imperative, and that is an understanding of self allows us to better communicate and to interact with those around us. So all of these are at play, and even as we think about the many things that are happening in our world today, intercultural communication really is a celebration of those who are around us in a way which creates space for them to share the uniqueness of their experience. And in doing so, and with the awareness of self, we are then able to bridge connection, bridge gaps, and perhaps understand things through a new perspective, a new lens that otherwise we wouldn't be able to navigate conflict with.
Yeah, I think I agree with both panelists just mentioned. I see intercultural communication is really as a daily experience, as we all live in a multicultural society here in Canada. So I think each of us actually is communicating, interacting with people from different cultural backgrounds on a daily basis. So in that sense, intercultural communication really becomes a constant feature of modern life or modern society. And having working with colleagues, with students, especially international students from a variety of cultural backgrounds, in the last couple of years, those all offers me a great chance to engage in intercultural communication on a daily basis. So I think, as the panelists just mentioned, intercultural communication really invite people to participate in a dialogue and to understand those cultural differences as well as similarities, to understand those cultural values, assumptions, norms, and practice in order to be more open, to be more tolerant, and to accept those different cultural groups, different cultural communities. And it invited people to participate in a dialogue and to find the common grounds to develop the shared understanding for better communication for our society.
Wow, thank you very much, panel. So we're hearing about diversity and bridging diversity, and one figures with all the fabulous technology that we have in the world and the increasing opportunities over the course of the 20th century and beyond it for people to travel and experience different cultures, that one would hope for some kind of overall global rapprochement among the many cultures of the world. And that may be true. This discussion is premised on, I'm going to quote, long-standing institutionally entrenched racial injustices in Canada and beyond. So having defined the imperative and the celebration of intercultural communication as you have, I invite the panel's thoughts on how you see racial injustices occurring and the role of communication in that process.
I'll start again with my response to that, Geo, and I really see this largely as systemic racism. That's one term that is being used today, and I'm so glad that it is something that is out in the foray and being looked at as, you know, as causes for what we're dealing with sometimes in government systems or in academic institutions. I see that systemic racism is entrenched within all of our systems and structures across society that has been really impacting, you know, early forms of legislation, for example, laws that, you know, that are built upon with precedent that then impact policies and processes that, you know, are foundational across government systems and right across society. And this really breaks down in every single facet. And so I thought about an example that, you know, we could all relate to, and that, you know, we all have to fill out forms in public service, in the public service domain. And these have not always adequately reflected the demography, let alone the needs of racialized groups. Another example is within health research. It has only been until very recently that we started to collect better indicators so that data is an accurate reflection and available for researchers to consider the diverse demography that exists within Canada. And then therefore, health services can be designed to better support the needs of Canadian society. Across whatever discipline or whatever research that is being conducted, that eventually also impacts education that is offered in higher learning. And I think that we will see better examples in the future as a result of some of the changes that are being made now.
Yeah, build upon the idea of system racism. And I think over the last couple of months, the issue become even more salient in our society. And I think those are the most important issues to our life, society, our teaching and practice. So I see there are academic journals publish special issues on those topics. And also their webinars, conference discussions have attracted a lot of attention from both academia, from practitioners, from the society. And I participated in a couple of those scholar conversations on those issues. And I see those offer us great ideas to look into how idea of superiority and operation are captured in everyday thinking on a system level, and help us to examine the big picture of how society operates. And I think it's very important to really increase the awareness of those issues, as those is also a process to increase, to really have a communication, or we say it's an intercultural communication process, because it really involves all groups to activate, to actively contribute to this conversation, to this discussion, as we need to hear all of the voices and to respect each culture and each group. And besides those more system level, I'm also thinking about as individuals, it also reminds us how our daily communication interaction with people from different cultural background, from different background, from different professional background, from different gender, from different even age. All of those factors offer us a perspective to look into how that the daily communication actually influence our thinking and our understanding on those issues.
Yeah, for me personally, I think anytime we want to talk about injustice, we really need to ask a question about inequity. Behind any conversation of injustice is really a question of whether the process is equitable at all. And so even as we look at some recent events in Canada, if we want to talk about what's happened with the Mi'kmaq and Treaty 1752, or if we want to look at even just how Canadians responded collectively to some of the events that happened in the US with Black Lives Matters, and really kind of distancing themselves and saying, that's there, that doesn't exist here, which in itself creates a whole nother conversation. And so, you know, this idea of racism doesn't exist. We can point at many things that have happened through the history of this country and things that are still happening in our contemporary context. I love that Wayne brought up the issue of, or the topic of health, you know, social determinants of health. When we talk about equity, when we talk about inequity, really, we're not only talking about outcomes, we're talking about opportunities too. So anytime we have an issue or a matter of unjust practice, it's really a matter of opportunities for said or X individual not having access to these. So we can see this in our educational system. We can see that by who is being represented in the classroom, what narratives are being told in the classroom. We see it with social determinants of health in terms of who has access to certain amenities, who is even, as Wayne has spoken to, being captured in the statistics as we even try to reformulate how we want to target certain populations. But, you know, I think about many elements of our society and some of the biggest challenges that our generation that will have to solve, or to at least put it down. And so I think about climate change. You know, climate change in itself, all of the conversations that come around that is a conversation of equity as well. Whether that's looking at climate justice, whether that's looking at sacrifice zones for certain populations. You know, when we talk about things like access to food or access to water, again, a conversation about inequity. If we want to talk about things like human rights, which is an ever expanding definition, and that in itself creates a multiplicity effect as we talk about racial injustice, and then thinking about other elements of the intersectional aspects of who a person is. So really, I think the conversation needs to not only look at injustice, but ask the question about the opportunities that are creating these unjust systems, the systemic racism that historically and really currently still affects and impacts the way in which different individuals interact with our society at large. Because if we truly do want to talk about Canada being multicultural, then we really need to start having conversations of what a diaspora's experience is here. But even more importantly, who the founders of this country were, what that narrative is. Because even as people come to this country, do they even understand what that is and what that means? Because that undoubtedly impacts the way they interact with the society at large.
Okay, I'm hearing you talk about systemic racism, deeply entrenched systems of injustice, and we're considering the role of communication in furthering and very shortly in trying to do something about ameliorating that process. I think a big learning item for me was just how insidious this institutionally entrenched and embedded racism can be. For example, I got a call from a colleague yesterday about some wording on an internal survey that's being done at our university, and the purveyors or perpetrators, if you will, of this survey were looking at the wording of other censuses out there, and they were using terms like white, majority, and minority. And that struck me as a case where, well, first of all, we don't have to play by those rules, but it struck me as a case where here you are baking in that discrimination in a light that could very easily be seen as pejorative, in something that people would think is as innocuous as a census, right? It's not something necessarily, oh, am I part of the minority? Well, in different parts of the country, guess what? You know, majorities change, and are there other ways we could be accessing information from people than in perpetuating racist systems?
Yeah, and I think to that end, language is so important. Wayne also raised this when he talked about even just what we fill out for Service Canada when we're given information about who we are as individuals. Is this representative of our contemporary context? But, I think the bigger conversation is around what is this future that we hope for ourselves, for our next generation, for our children and so on. Because even as we talk about concepts of intercultural communication, and our role really as communicators, we think about it from a globalized perspective. And so if we talk about globalization, Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum, really talked about he's coined this term of globalization 4.0. And really this being the point in history where we can actually impact leaving nobody behind and really targeting all communities, all populations. And so conversations around injustice, conversations around deprivation of rights, deprivation of services, deprivation of access to resources start to be a huge point of our conversation. And so even as we have that and we shift our conversation from minorities to BIPOC, or shift our conversation from male and female to being representative of all experiences, and we shift our conversations to really think about races as a way to celebrate them as opposed to historically what they've been used as a point of creating some form of stratification as well. So I think we do need to consider language, and that is something that is apparent in our textbook, it's apparent in our classrooms, it's apparent in health systems, and all the way to government structures and government systems as well.
I know that Juana and Wayne speak languages beyond the one we are speaking right now. Any comments from you on Olaolu's point on language?
Yeah, I think that's really a great point, as Olaolu mentioned about the idea of intersectionality. And I think it also, I call that idea because that also deals with our identity when we talk about language. And each of us actually has a combination of identity, like our race, our ethnicity, our gender, social class, sexuality, professional roles, age, etc. And all of those will inform our experience in life and our interaction with the community, with the world. So I also have conducted some empirical research about cultural identity, identity and cultural diversity in organizations. So Olaolu just mentioned about the idea of intersectionality. I think that's a very helpful idea, as it's about when we talk about those polarized gaps, those justice issues, we also have to consider the intersections of identity and how that could impact our perceptions, impact our daily experience. In many situations, I think people intend to really focus more some more visible factors, such as the color of hair, race, as we just mentioned. But as people, we are really far more than just race, and our experience actually are shaped far more than color of hair, color of eyes. And I think, look at the panelists today, we definitely are a very diverse panel. Think about our gender, our race, our ethnicity, our professional background, experience, etc. So back to your question, I think we really have to examine those factors and try to avoid only emphasize a single perspective or single factor. That's not going to help us to avoid those polarizing conversations or those gaps between people, gaps between community. So I think it's very meaningful to always remind ourselves about those perspectives we hold and the assumptions, those cultural values, those lying behind each perspective in order to have more meaningful dialogue or conversation.
For me, language is something that I deal with every single day. In an Indigenous context, language is offered in Manitoba for people who wish to have their language of choice part of their healthcare experience. And so I manage the Indigenous groups, and we have interpreters that provide service in the language. And there's always a challenge because the providers sometimes don't necessarily understand that there isn't direct terminology for specific medical terms or other language or terminology that is related to the healthcare encounter that is taking place. And there isn't words for some of these issues or specific terms being discussed. So the interpreter has to do the job of explaining this in a manner that is appropriate, but an actual reflection of what's taking place. So for example, there's a very good understanding of consent and the consequences of what someone's life is basically, in the hands of these in these situations. And so we provide cultural safety education to the providers so they understand what this process is, and that the language interpreters are trained medical interpreters who are certified. And they have to trust that they are doing their jobs, just like the French or the German or the other language interpreter is having to provide. That being said, I think language in an Indigenous worldview is very different in the context of what it means in terms of some of the language or the terms are all related to other things that are always sort of connected to family and land and animals. And it's incredible how that lexicon is all part of this interconnected worldview that is only understood often by those that speak the language or those that have studied the language. So it's important to note that these perspectives exist and that we have forced them to fit within our system, our health system, for a very long time, where we may not even have met their health needs because we never understood their health, their perspective on health in the first place.
Wow. Of course, thank you for those thoughts on language. Language, of course, is one of many other forms of communication that can take place. Much communication, for example, being nonverbal. Is there? Have you any other thoughts on the role of language on this issue in intercultural communication before we leave it? Okay, then let me riddle you this. We are seeing in the headlines all too often notions of widening, polarizing gaps between people holding different perspectives on issues, perspectives that can often be, if not determined by culture, certainly strongly influenced by culture. What do you think might be causing those gaps, and what's the role of communication there in that process?
I think when we are looking at our contemporary context, we first have to understand and really appreciate the fact that we are more connected than we've ever been. And Manuel Castells talks about this idea of information society, that we live in an information society where we're inundated with information. And I think it's too much, and to the point where now we don't even know what information to take and what information to leave behind. And so one component is that we're not even able to filter information in a way which is efficient or effective. The other way is, I think, from a critical thinking lens, now we are continually asking, is this fake? Is this legitimate information? Or is this something which has been fabricated? And then add that to the conversation about us now living in, whether you argue for a global village or a global metropolis, we now are able to see what is happening in so many other parts of the world in a way which we never were able to do so before. So I think the combination of information society, us living in a global village, global metropolis, and then we are now surveyed more than we ever have been before, whether that's your use of your credit card, whether that's when you go into the airport and they make you extend and they scan you in many different ways, whether that's now stores knowing your purchase patterns, or you go on Instagram and all of a sudden now the advert pops out. We have all of this that is contributing to our everyday experience. And so I think the polarization comes as a result of the impact of surveillance, the impact of us being more connected than ever before, and now us being inundated with so much information that we actually really don't know what to do with it. And so now, as a result, what is happening is we're not even speaking to each other, we're speaking at each other with perhaps information that is incomplete, and it's really based more on an opinion than actual founded in something which is evidence. And I think somehow our connectivity has actually taken away from our connectedness, because now we are relying on something external to provide information to then allow us to communicate in a way which really is not as human, or hasn't been the way humans have for so many years. And I think we really should be looking at the opportunity of these platforms to create solidarity. Instead, I think, unfortunately, they're being used as ways to create division, and it's more divisive. I'll also add empathy. Sorry, there's been a lack of empathy, and that really is a key, even as we speak about intercultural communication. We can't have effective intercultural communication without being mindful and being empathetic.
Yeah, just to build upon the idea of cultural empathy, as a panelist just mentioned, I think it's very important to be mindful of those similarities and differences. As in a lot of situations, I think it's more easier for us to really see those differences. And so it's very important to really develop the cultural empathy, so we can really switch perspectives and to put ourselves in other shoes in order to appreciate those differences. And I think it's more important to develop cultural empathy in order to find those common ground. And those common ground are really the base to build a mutual understanding and to engage more dialogue and conversation for more meaningful communication.
So I think from my perspective, I think the issues exist around individuals and groups that fail to recognize their own privilege or cannot acknowledge the history or the backgrounds that have created their privilege. It's important that people acknowledge their own bias. That is not just the only thing. There's the need to then take the necessary action, and that might be, changing the approach that one would take in a professional context, or within society, like as a neighbor or citizen, and the education that's needed to, I think perhaps impact these gaps, making them smaller, is having cultural awareness. And I know that it's probably very difficult to have awareness about every single culture that exists in Canada, but just having an awareness that there are different kinds of people with different backgrounds and so forth. And then having some level of competency to be able to respond in an appropriate manner. And I think that that's through communication, through ensuring equity among programs, for example, or training or education. And if you're not the expert, then we do have experts that can support that, so that it can be perhaps broken down a little bit more. So for example, with Indigenous cultural safety is something that we're promoting within the healthcare system today. So there's the awareness, and then after the awareness comes cultural safety. And then I think we're in a place where we're starting to then be able to measure outcomes that are based on some of the changes that we've been putting in place. with Indigenous peoples, there's been a long history of special reports, papers, research that have been done by government going back to the 1960s with the Hawthorne Report. That was essentially the very same things that were later written about in the white paper and the red paper response in the 70s, and then later with the RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and then finally with the Truth and Reconciliation final report. If you line these four reports up, they basically say the same thing. And so we're now at a point where we actually have some training and it is being institutionalized. So I see that as some progress. But of course, these gaps continue to widen. And I think they're based on political points of view that are basically entrenched with perspectives and a mindset that people cannot acknowledge their privilege. But I think it's probably a lot more complicated than that, but that is certainly one perspective.
I would also suggest that, you know, the awareness of the privilege is really just the start of the conversation, because even if we want to talk about cultural competence, how do we measure one's cultural competence? You know, obviously it's something which inevitably becomes very qualitative as opposed to quantitative. And to that end, even if you talk about, you know, these reports and them not changing, really it's actually a conversation again about equity. Who are writing these reports? How are these people who are in these positions of power that are writing these reports continually placed in this position to continually tell this narrative? Because that in itself is part of the problem. Until the stories are actually reflective of the populations that they hope to serve, they're never going to be able to fulfill the mandate. And so I go back to my point about information society, because I think, you know, it's one thing to be aware of X event that has happened in a different locale, but I think many of us are actually disconnected with what's happening in our immediate reality. And as a result, we're not reflecting those realities because we're not getting in touch with people who have been impacted in the very places in which we're situated.
Okay, thank you. So let's, some of this you've already addressed in your answers, but to frame the question directly, as professional communicators, as people who practice communication in the course of their work on a daily basis, what could we do to improve the state of public dialogue on racial injustice beyond equipping ourselves individually, acknowledging our privilege, cultural empathy, and safety, the invaluable aims that you described? How can we begin to get at discussing and promoting real change for the better as professional communicators?
So once we talk about professional communicators or educators here, I think one idea immediately pop into hand is about when we work students and when we teach. And I think it's, as we talked about the idea of cultural awareness and the communication competence, I think as educators or professional communicators, we have to constantly remind ourselves about where we come from, our check about our bias, and also to communicate to our learners. And I think we can really help them to also to develop the cultural awareness and to engage in those public dialogues, or even to become the leaders of those public dialogues. For instance, we have undergraduate and graduate students who are studying professional communication, intercultural communication. So they're studying those global communication, intercultural communication courses, both at the bachelor and the master's programs. And I think our learners can really make a positive change to the community and the society. And another way to promote those real change is really through those scholar conversations and research activities. And our learners and each of us all engage in those research activities, and many here at Railroads are conduct action-based research with different cultural communities. I think that's really help to connect with people, to work with the different community, and in order to really to establish those common ground and to bring people together. And I think that's a very important step to really start the conversation, those intercultural dialogue, and as a way to promote a real change.
I agree with Juana on that, because research is often how we start to see changes in the curriculum and other models that are used within society. And the importance of research is sometimes not always upheld by professional communicators, because we are busy communicating. And communications as a field is often very cross-cutting across all the disciplines. And so, for example, one of the things that we see now actively a part of a lot of research studies is the need for knowledge translation, so that the groups or peoples that are involved with research, whether they're involved in a participatory action methodology or they're participating in some other ways, that there's some meaningful outcome that can be translated for how that research will impact them on the ground, for example, in a change. And this, I remember there being Dr. Arvind Singhal teaching about this in the Master of Professional Communication program, in terms of how communication could impact social movements and social change, with various research studies in third world countries. And so we can also see research that is done in law or in environmental science, whatever the discipline is, but that communication should be a part of that, so that we can see how the changes can be applied in various contexts.
Yeah, I love that you brought in Dr. Singhal's perspective on positive deviance is the term. And it's really this that, again, celebrates this idea of positionality, or this idea of standpoint perspective. And really, once again, this is a conversation about how do we utilize, how do we maximize the perspectives, how do we maximize the experiences of those who are living in the global South and in other parts of the world, and use that as a way to leverage the change in their communities, because they are the ones who are most in touch with these matters. So I think, we talk about being professional communicators, and it is interesting because historically, when you think about who has told the narrative, who has really pushed for change, people look at artists often for that. They look at musicians, they look at theatrical productions and the like. But if the responsibility is truly to fall on a professional communicator, then again, it has to be about narratives, and it has to be about seeking out those narratives that aren't being told, or that aren't being representative of the population at large. And more importantly, the voices that have been disenfranchised and put to the side. So whether it's through positive deviance approaches, whether it's about celebrating experiential learning opportunities, whether it's about more autoethnographic approaches to how we share and how we communicate within the academic sphere, it needs to inevitably point back to those who right now do not have a voice. I think we also need to think about what it means to leverage the platforms that we have. We can't continue to use these, for lack of a better term, archaic ways of relaying and conveying information. If people are on TikTok, then we need to find a way to use TikTok. If people are more in tune with Instagram, then we need to use that, because as a professional communicator, you don't get to dictate the medium of choice per se. You have to adapt in order to make your information palatable to X population, to X public. And so I think it's one thing to leverage a platform, it's another thing to be in touch with where people are on the spectrum of change. Bennett talks about this idea of this development model of intercultural sensitivity, and how we go from ethnocentrism to ethno-relativism, and how initially people kind of start in this position of being kind of reluctant to hear any sort of change. And hopefully by the end, the idea is that we get to a point of integrating. So understanding where society is, where people are on that continuum, and then adapting your platform, adapting your message to make it palatable to said public in order to make sure that they're actually able to eat and to understand.
Okay, thank you very much, panel. I can see by the clock on the wall, Wayne and Schuster, 1971, that it's time for the Q&A segment of our program. And I invite any of our 54 participants who are not on the panel, I guess that would be 51, to contribute offer your questions in the chat box, and our panel will happily endeavor to respond to them. And while you are composing your thoughts for questions, I guess I'll ask one final question to our panel to iris back out, as they do at the end of Westerns, the movie, not the culture, or maybe it's a culture too. As individual citizens, is there anything that you haven't covered? As individual citizens, how can we become better at intercultural communication, and where can we tangibly start?
I think as individuals, we need to look at relationships. Martin Luther King, the late great Dr. Martin Luther King said, we can learn to live together as brothers or to perish together as fools. And the reality is, when an incident happens, it evokes something in you. So from that position where something has been evoked or it evokes a certain emotion, we need to then start to inquire. And then through that inquiry, hopefully we reach a point of empathy. And I think when we build relationships, when an event happens to a said population, it impacts us in a completely different way because now it's personalized. And so if your car was to break down, Dr. Takach, you have three options really of how you'd fix it, unless of course you have some skills that I'm not aware of. But your first would be to either read a manual of some sort or to watch on YouTube. The second would be in some shape or form to perhaps call somebody to help you. And the third would be to actually take it to a mechanic. And the last option may cost you more, but inevitably, at least this person is at least skilled and versed in this area. And I think we need to approach these issues in our world today in a similar manner. You can read texts, you can watch movies, you can watch documentaries, but if you have a personal relationship with somebody, sit down with them, break some bread, have those interactions, have their standpoint, have their personal accounts to influence how you're seeing the world, but also to see that their perspective may be completely different from the one which you're reading in those texts as well.
I think that's the best way, of course, to, I guess, learn and grow and have relationships. I'm unfortunately often dealing uphill battles where we are continuously having to deal with feedback from patients that haven't been necessarily, very positive outcomes, to put it mildly. And so my thoughts are, of course, if you can make that individual change or you can keep an open mind and do learn and grow, that's great. But what I sort of, another philosophy that I have is, if we can't change behavior, we can change processes. And so we're we're doing that to ensure that that people can stay safe and that there's equitable healthcare.
And I think build upon the discussions on cultural awareness and cultural empathy, and I think it's very important always check about our cultural assumptions and perspectives, as there are certain assumptions lying behind. So always to be very mindful of those assumptions and to be very open and adaptable, and in order to appreciate the different perspectives and to have more open and transparent communication, and in order to work with those different cultural communities and to get the real change for the better.
Okay, thank you very much. We have some positive responses in the chat box. Yelling yes and changing behavior, absent which change the processes. Here is a specific question around the role of the academy. On the subject of research and equity, how do we advance our communication and reflections through research when so many marginalized individuals are ostracized from even being included in academia? Is research and academia really the way to bridge gaps with racial reactions, or is it a more dividing factor?
I'd like to jump in for that. I think it has been a dividing factor for sure, but there is new approaches that are being used that involve the community and should involve the community, especially if the researchers are proposing to do work that has to do with that specific group. By no means should there be research funded that doesn't include some endorsement of what's taking place and some level of involvement by that community that is being researched. And then around ensuring that there's equity within the academy itself, because often, you know, the community is one part of the research spectrum, but having actual, you know, academics from all walks of life is extremely important, and ensuring that they're part of the academy and a part of research is foundational to ensuring intercultural communication.
I would agree. I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. I do, though, like Wayne has said, believe that there has to be an emphasis on participatory processes. There needs to be an emphasis on incorporating perspectives, whether it's from the Global South or institutions which historically have not been welcomed into the conversation. You know, when we think about something like the Sustainable Development Goals and the approach that was taken, really the idea was to garner perspectives from people in the Global South in a way which hasn't had that input before. And I think it's the same conversation even as we're having today. If you want to help a community, if you want to research a community and the voices, whether it's the voices on the ground or the voices reporting, aren't representative of that community, inevitably you're just recreating the same problem over and over again.
Yeah, I want to echo what the panelists just mentioned and about the participatory approach to really be part of the community and to hear those real voice from the community, from the particular group in order to understand the real issue, the real question. And I think that's actually a starting point really to conduct some meaningful research and to in order to develop those research results, tackle those real issues.
Thank you, Juana, Olaolu, and Wayne. We are just about at 1 o'clock. I just want to give the panel an opportunity to get a last word in edgewise. Do you have anything you'd like to say that you haven't had the opportunity to say yet?
Our esteemed colleague, Dr. Walinga, said this to me earlier this year, before pre-COVID, and we were sitting down for coffee, and she said that conflict is really just mismanaged diversity. And, you know, really stuck with me, and it struck me. And I would just like to add to that, that it is not only mismanaged diversity, but really it's also this inequitable and celebration, without knowing it consciously or consciously, celebration of inequitable practices. So if we are able to be aware of the beauty of our diversity and celebrate that, and also be aware of the dynamics and systems which have caused inequity and address them, I think then we can start to have some progress.
Thank you very much. Juana and Wayne?
I'd just like to add that this has been a really terrific discussion, and I really appreciate the perspectives of the panel and the great questions that were raised, Geo, and thanks again for this opportunity.
Yeah, I want to say thank you to for this opportunity to work together to work on this panel. And also thanks to Geo to host this conversation.
Okay, well, on behalf of the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads University, located on the beautiful traditional lands of the Kosamsam and Lekwungen families. Thank you all so much for joining us. Special thanks to our hosting team, ultra special, intercultural, multicultural thanks to our three wonderful panelists for joining us and sharing the riches of their insights, their wisdom, their intellect, and their empathy. Thank you all so very much. Thank you for your comments in the chat box. And in closing, be well, stay safe, and let's all try to get along. Bye for now.